It's it's a different feeling to be with you all. I'm gonna turn the light on. It's a different feeling to be with you all during the daytime. Okay, let's see. Let's share my screen here. Desktop número dos. Okay, we're gonna do slideshow. So today's slide deck theme, as you can see, is the St. Patrick's Day. Um, which, it's a loaded topic, but for for this series, I as an Irish American, I feel okay with it. And also, just like I've said before, kind of like grounding us into the time of the year and like kind of helping us find the rhythm. I think, we've all celebrated like different holidays, in our life and like had probably certain associations with each season. And some of them are shared and some of them are similar and some of them are different. So I just offered this one as like one of the ones I celebrated growing up and still do a little bit because my mom is Irish American and we would always have like a special meal on St. Patrick's Day. And so I think I guess another thing I think of when I think of like mid to early March is that we all share is like the beginning of COVID. And so it's really interesting for me, like every year since then, because um, when I see certain flowers flowering now, I'm like almost like reminded of that like traumatic experience. And I think about like, oh, this is like COVID, like it's like instinctual from just like seeing like the spring like plum blossoms and then like the wisteria. And so just having these relationships with those plants at that time, I think is just a really interesting way to kind of like get in sync and get into the rhythm of nature and specifically like within this bioregion. So anyway, I feel like that's something I'm always practicing and like encourage people to kind of notice and like create their own associations, but be it with like birthdays or like flowers or foods or, really anything that feels relevant. Just another way to kind of connect to the more than human world. Okay, so today we have a lot of different things to do, and they all take like a fairly short amount of time. So we'll do a little land acknowledgement, and then we're going to talk about garden design, come back to that idea with a few more aspects, and then talk a little bit about mushrooms, and then you're going to go on a break and you have some homework during the break, which I'll tell you about, and then we're going to talk about soil. And then we're going to talk about asexual propagation, also known as cloning. And then we're going to go back to the soil test. And then we'll have some time to just like chat and check in. So if you need to leave early, you can, or if you want to like stay and hang out, please do. I think we have a lot to talk about. And I think we're just after like the midpoint of the course. And so, or like, yeah, we're halfway. Um, and so after Saturday, we'll be more than halfway. And it's just a good time to kind of like speak up if you want to like learn something specific or like do more, etc. Okay, so I wanted to pass the mic over to you all. If there's anything that you want to like mention, if there's any orgs, any books, anything that within like Indigenous rights or within the Ohlone nation or another Indigenous nation that you're somehow connected to, just like, yeah, is there any like thing that we should know about or any recommendations anybody has?
I have some positive news from the Esalen tribe.
Oh yeah.
So I, in this last year, I actually made a couple of connections with some folks that are of the Esalen tribe, and a lot of people maybe have heard of the Esalen Institute down in Big Sur. That's where they're located, is in Big Sur and Monterey, is where the Esalen tribe is from. And they just recently were given Little Sur Stream, one over 1,000 acres was just returned to them, and they are working on the land actively now to remediate and to reconnect with that space. So
Very cool.
that's Esalen tribe of Monterey.
Thanks, Raina. That's awesome.
Yeah, beautiful.
How are you connected to them?
Yeah, it's kind of a longish story. If I could, I would rather not talk
Yeah.
about it online. Yeah,
Okay.
but I'm happy to share with all of you. I just don't want it recorded on YouTube.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sounds good. We can
Hmm.
check back in on Saturday
Yeah,
if
I'd
you
love
want.
that. Yeah, for sure.
Okay, cool. Anybody else have something they want to share?
I feel like you guys probably already all know about the book Braiding Sweetgrass, but it's a really amazing book that is written by a Native woman, kind of in the area that I grew up in the Finger Lakes of New York. So when I read it, I was like, oh my gosh, he's talking about my home. But just lots of good nuggets and wisdom in there.
Totally. Life changer. Robin Wall Kimmerer is her name if you haven't come across her work. This is her most recent book, The Serviceberry, which is also a great book that you can get at your local library. I find it in the Lucky Day section. Check out your Lucky Day section if you haven't. Okay, cool. Well, thank you both. I'll go back to my slide deck. Okay. Um, so garden design. I'm gonna just chat a little bit about some different concepts. I remember we talked about this, I think, pretty early on. And then we did some drawings last 2 times ago, I guess. So, um, in these different concepts, I'd love for you all maybe to just think for a moment, and if you want to share out loud, unmute and share. Like so there's these different designs, right? Like raised bed, row crops, herb spirals, formal gardens. Um, so here's a raised bed, and I wonder, what do you think are some pros and cons to this design? Like at Cali Bird, we're doing raised beds.
Um, hmm. Maybe it's not as feels like not as rooted to the earth. Uh, there's another the pro is that it's unlike like a pot. It seems like it has more space and more simulates what it might be to kind of have like more space to grow. But then vertically, it feels like it's not grounded as much.
Yeah, absolutely. Like it kind of has like more of a container feel. I think too, maybe one thing you're picking up on, Ganesh, is um like the potted soil. Like you would have to like bring in the soil or like fill it kind of like the way you might like tend to house plant. So um yeah. Any other thoughts on like raised bed? Like if you imagine like designing a garden or having your own garden, would you want this? Would you not want this?
So I'm hanging back because I have a ton of answers, but I want other folks to be able to respond.
One of the things I know is that like raised beds tend to be a little bit more accessible. So if somebody can't like bend and kind of work on their knees like on the ground, the raised beds do make it a little bit easier for some people and
Absolutely.
everybody really. It's kind of
And
easier to
what?
and everybody really. It just makes it kind of easy for everybody to work in.
Yeah. Like, so if you have like reduced mobility, if you're in a wheelchair,
Hmm.
if you're a senior, yeah.
Yeah, there's in the community gardens here in San Francisco, there's actually a requirement that 10% of the beds now need to be accessible beds. So they're actually intentionally higher so that they're more of at like a desk height so that someone in a wheelchair can just come right up and work in it. Or anyone, right? Also, like you were saying about bending over and whatnot. Like it's, just more ergonomic to be a little higher um, in certain conditions.
Hmm. That's so
That's
cool. I didn't know that.
yeah. All right. Any Raina, do you want to put in your professional
I'll just
perspective?
I'll say one because it's definitely related to Calibird is so by bringing using beds when you have an area where there's maybe unhealthy or contaminated soils below, or even if you have a hardscape, right? Like or you have sorry a hard surface, having the bed allows you to have clean soil and soil that also exactly what's in there and you're adding to it. So it sort of also gives you more control if you want that. Um, and then, yeah, I think that's good.
Cool. Yeah. So that's a great point. Is like in this picture, this is like a lawn, but it could have been like a school playground. And then you could like bring this in and have it um on asphalt. All right. So I have some of the answers here. Of course, it's not an exhaustive list, but just some things to think about. So, like we said, it's ADA accessible, easier on everyone's back, great for elders. There's like a semi-permanentness to it as far as like it's an installation. And then a big part of using I don't have pollution here, but a big part of raised beds in my life have been gopher problems. And so you can put hardware cloth, which is kind of like chicken wire, but it's just square and it's like more condensed. At the bottom, like you can see here, this is lined with something. And so you can like put things at the bottom to prevent like critters from getting in. You could even put something on the top, right? And it's like more contained and there's like a structure and stuff. Who knows why this particular plant? I'm not sure what it is. Cardoon or something. I don't know, but for some reason they wanted that like specifically protected. Some cons are like this can be really expensive. Generally, you don't want to use treated wood because it's been pressurized and there's like a lot of chemicals on it. And so the best wood to use is redwood, which is expensive and there's like an environmental cost there too. I guess a con is also that it's semi-permanent, right? If you like go through the work of like creating it and like the cost, it's hopefully you're planning for a longer time. I think it can also be like a little bit harder to like get in there. I say here it's harder to amend the soil. I think in some ways it's actually easier because it's like a contained or controlled amount of soil, whereas like in a native bed or like a bed that's just like in the ground, you have to like really you have to put in like 30% mass of that to actually like change the soil. So, every project is going to have different needs. And so these are just some things to think about. But I think, for modern urban gardening, this is a good bet. But there are some drawbacks. Okay, so this is a different option. This is a row crop. So what do we think are some pros and cons here?
Uh, Things can come and get at it. So I guess the reverse of the gopher problem and stuff like that can happen here. Just harder in general. It's not as controlled an environment. So like a raised bed, so it's just harder to make sure things survive and grow well, and um, I guess easier for various kinds of diseases and stuff to spread
Yeah.
in the plants getting diseases. Yeah,
And what you're
but
saying too,
it
oh,
kind
go
of
ahead.
it's kind of nice that it gets closer to the natural environment in which the plants would grow. There's
Yeah.
something nice about that.
Like the connectedness that you were missing with the other one.
Yeah.
I think you were saying too about like the pests, like if there was maybe something like in the air or like spreading between the plants, like because there's a lot of more plant mass, like it might be harder to control too. Any other pros or cons you can see here?
And it's easier for irrigation and watering,
Mm.
the
Oh yeah, we
access
see.
and access to the plants by having the rows in between, like the
Yeah,
walking.
we see the drip irrigation here too, so you kind of have different options for like that structure and stuff. This is a much bigger area as far as like where the crops are being produced, I believe. It's hard to, I guess it's hard to say exactly, but we see this a lot at Alamany Farm in like a traditional way of growing vegetables. And so you can just produce a lot in this style. It's pretty efficient to just like move down the row. Um, and this is kind of how all of our food is grown essentially in like a industrial scale. And you can also have like machines come in here. You can have machines like planting all these broccolis, sowing the seeds. So, um, yeah, there's different pros and cons. Um, it's kind of boring. I think this is a very Western concept of like putting things into rows. Um, and I think it just tends itself more towards vegetables, although I have been on farms that are herb farms that have this of chamomile or echinacea. Um, I do think it requires a certain amount of space. Um, and I think it really controls the way, like the physical way that our bodies and our minds interact with it. Like I notice when I'm working um in a space like this, like it's more about like production and efficiency and like productivity. Whereas in like if I'm in the herb garden at Alamany Farm where I work on Fridays, like it's more of a like curiosity and kind of this like experiential like wandering sort of feeling. So we talked about that last time of like how do we create those types of spaces and like bring in the people that we want to bring in and have them interact with it in these different ways. Okay, so this is something for some reason, people just like somehow like naturally gravitate to this concept of like an herb spiral. And I'm not sure why. I think it might be, like I mentioned last time we met in person, like um I think it might come from this like concept of permaculture, although I didn't ever take a permaculture course, so I'm not entirely sure. But you'll like hear this term like all everywhere. Anytime people talk about growing herbs, they're like, "Oh, should we make an herb spiral?" And I think part of what the design is that it's supposed to like move upward and by doing so almost in like a pyramid effect, then you create like vertical space. So I think that that's interesting, but I would say all the herb spirals I've seen like kind of look like this, where it's like it's not really that much herbs, and like it's usually like a lot of these culinary herbs, and you're like, is that even really doing that well? Like, how long have these things been here? I don't know. I'm very skeptical of the herb spiral, and I think partly is that I think that there's also like an unconscious bias about herbs where people are like vegetables, like we need them and we need them to be like hearty and big. And then with herbs, people are like, oh, they're like precious and cute. And I'm like, no, everyone needs herbs. We need to have more of them. Um, and especially culinary herbs, like we can use them so much more and increase the medicinal value of our food. So, um, I have a lot of questions about herb spirals. I've never seen one that I think was really working well, but I do think it could be like maybe more water efficient or a good use of space if you're tight on space, which a lot of times in the city we are. And I believe this is specifically for perennials, so plants that live like many years, and that way you don't have to be like digging things in and out. But not all herbs are perennials, right? Chamomile is an annual um, parsley, cilantro. So depends on what you're growing. Um, I don't, I just don't know how easy this is to navigate also, physically, and I don't know where it came from, but for some reason, lots of people, lots of gardens will have herb spirals. Any questions here?
Have to say, I like the idea of a spiral if it was like a similar to the row crop where it's actually just physically a spiral. So instead of straight lines, you're, walking into the spiral into the center. I've actually never even heard of this way of doing it where it's stacked like that.
Oh, interesting. But you've seen gardens where it would be more of like a physical experience of walking in a spiral?
I actually just did that a couple of days ago where the plants were intentionally grown into a spiral like a nautilus shape or something, and you walk through them to the center.
That sounds great.
Yeah, that'd be all
I would
right.
lo love to pick your brain about great gardens around the city. Maybe we can do a show. That'll be our share question for Saturday. Like, what's the best garden that you know of that we should visit?
Okay, I'll think about it too, and maybe pick some other people's brains in the office.
Okay,
Yeah, cool.
cool. So there's this one last style of garden that is like a formal garden or an English garden, and the idea is that these are um stepping stones right here, and the idea is that like um there's like rows in between, and I would say this is kind of like a combination of like this and this of like you have like productivity and you have like each herb and it's like little section. I've never seen anybody do this. I used to do a lot of landscaping and I've seen gardens like in Pacific Heights and stuff like designed like this. But just like with ornamentals. I don't find this to be an inspiring thing to be in. I think that there's a lot of structure that goes into this. But anyway, I did steal this off the internet, but at least I gave them some credit. Anyway, just a couple different things I offer because I think when I've like been going through gardening books and such, like this is a concept that they kind of like offer and I think my personal takeaway is like you know, allowing there to be like kind of a connection to the land and a site specific um intention to like come through that space. So um anyway, I like to design gardens that feel accessible. So whether that's a raised bed or a meandering path, um, plants also need certain types of, you know, amenities, whether that's water or sun or soil quality. And so, thinking about where a plant is going to thrive the best, how tall is it? We don't really want the tall plants to be in the front because then we might not get to the plants in the back or they'll make shade. Um, and creating something that is useful. So that's enough about that. Um, okay. Any questions before I move on here? I think I've gone over this in a few ways, but yeah.
Well, what about from the plant's perspective? Like, what is what do the plants like, or what would be ideal for them?
Yeah, I mean, that's such a great question. Thank you for asking it. Every plant has different needs. And so it really depends on like what the plant's native habitat is like. Um, w One thing I like to think about is, well, first of all, like I've probably said before, every plant is an individual, so we have to get to know plants like one on one. Um, but one example I can give you is that there's a handful of plants that grow in like a forest that we use, and so when you're growing in a forest and you're not a tree, you're actually in a lot of shade. And so when I was in herb school, I got assigned a bed, a couple beds, like an area of the garden to take care of. And it was the shade garden. And what my teachers did was they created like a structure of shade because they lived in a pretty sunny area. And there was like wild yam growing on a trellis. There was bleeding heart, which grows around here, like in the forest. And then there's like some Appalachian plants like um, blue cohosh and black cohosh and bloodroot, I think. So all these plants like grow on the forest floor. And so like not living in a forest, they had to create that shade. And so I think that sometimes that is one answer to your question, right? I think there's also other aspects of it, like a plant that's really aromatic, like sage or rose geranium or a rosemary, rue, like all of these plants are often grown near doorways and near in like paths where people walk a lot. And I think that there's an aspect to plants that some of them want to be near people and want to have like a lot of attention, and other plants want to be like farther away and they might do better in a place where like there's not as much activity. And so I think one thing we'll talk about later tonight too is like if there's specific plants that you want to get to know, we can kind of like dial in those in a little bit more and try to focus on them. So yeah, if there's plants that we aren't working with or we haven't like talked about and we want to like learn about them. One thing I actually realized about this group that I forgot to kind of mention, I don't know, I think it was because of the rain that first day. Um, Usually in this class, what I offer or what I encourage people to do as an option is to choose one plant and do a little presentation on it. And so I know we're like halfway through, but if people wanted to on the last day, we could do some presentations and not everybody has to do it. But this is one way that I think is just really good to like dive in and start doing some of your own research. Um, and so I can talk about that a little bit more later, but just think like maybe, over now in this class, right? Like, would you want to do that? Is there a certain plant that you would want to get to know? Okay, cool. Um, so this is a really quick announcement, which is that Isaiah has offered to teach us about how to grow mushrooms in a bucket. And I'm really excited about this because um, I've always wanted to incorporate mushrooms into my herb gardens. As far as like species, I'm talking about like shiitake, oyster, like edible medicinal mushrooms. And what I believe we need is like everybody needs a bucket, ideally a 5-gallon bucket. And I know that we have some at the farm. I've also been trying to track some down on like Craigslist free stuff. So what I wanted to ask you all is maybe look around if you have one, bring it. Also, if you're part of like a free cycle thing and you can pick up like 2 buckets, that would also be great. So just like throwing that out there to see what we can come up with, and then um, we can move forward. And it's okay if it's got some holes in it. Okay, so we are gonna go on a break. we have a 10-minute break because you have this assignment. So either you might not be able to do either of these, and that's okay. But what I recommend is if you can, go outside and get some soil and then put it in a jar and fill the jar up with water and put a lid on it. That's option number one. Okay. Option number two is go find a rosemary or a geranium bush. Those are very common in San Francisco. So you might have to go, take a give an offering to your neighbor's plant or, you know, whatever. But if you can think of one that's like nearby, maybe you could go take a cutting of it, and when you come back, bring it back with you with a little glass of water or soil if that's easy, but water is fine. So I'm gonna give you all 10 minutes. It's 6:34, so we'll be back at 6:44. And good luck. Any questions before we leave? Okay.
Nope, sounds fun.
Wait, I have a question, Bonnie, Rose. So,
Yes.
can it be like soil, like from like a potting soil bag, or like soil from
Yeah.
the ground?
Um, Either one works.
Okay,
Yeah.
thanks.
Yeah.